Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Don't mind the strange location here. Life is taking me to strange locations lately, but more on that later. For now, I'm more interested in speaking with you about this strange lens. This is the TT Artisan 100mm 2.8 2x macro tilt shift lens. It's a lot, that's a big mouthful of stuff, and this lens is like the Homer Simpson car.
The Homer!
It does everything. It's a little ugly, but just like Homer, I love it. And so we're gonna talk today about this lens and why it's not perfect, why it's a little strange, who it could work for, all of those wonderful and good things that you've come to expect from my channel, and hopefully show you some photos that you'll enjoy. So this lens, as I mentioned, has a big feature list with a relatively small price tag. As many of you know, I've been reviewing TT Artisan lenses for quite a while, and while I do have a fondness in general for TT Artisan and what they provide as far as affordability in the lens space, rarely am I blown away by the image quality or quality in general that they provide. So I went into this review with low expectations. Having said that, this lens on paper really is absolutely perfect for the type of photography that I do as a documentary photographer focused on rural architectural decay or rural dystopia. This lens gives me several things in one package that I get really excited about, and those things are: one, the compression and flatness, or what I like to call the squared up compression that only a long lens can provide, like a 100mm. Number two is the shift capability, which allows me to eliminate vertical distortion in camera, which normally I have to correct digitally in software, which slightly degrades the image quality when I do that. It's always better to correct things like perspective distortion in camera if you can. Number three, the macro capability, but not only macro, but 2x macro. And there's a fourth thing that this lens offers, which is, it's less exciting to me, but maybe to others. And that's the shift capability, which, yeah, more of a novelty to me, but I can see why some people might get excited about that. So in this video, we're going to figure out how well this lens performs in these areas, as well as its general image quality. But first, I'm super excited to share with you the sponsor of this video, who has been equally exciting to me over the past couple months, and that's Ekster. When Ekster reached out to me, I immediately recognized the name because of their awesome smart wallet, which has garnered a lot of attention. But they have also recently released something equally as exciting for those who travel and who take pictures and need a place to put their stuff, and that is the Grid Backpack. Whether you're a photographer, adventurer, or someone who takes their fun very seriously, this pack protects your gear for any kind of trip. I've now taken this bag with me on several trips, which include business and travel photography, and a funeral, as well as just around locally. And I immediately saw reflected in this bag the fact that Ekster had designed something special, and that was a bag suitable for a business meeting in the morning and a rugged adventure that same afternoon. To do that, Ekster partnered up with 6 adventurers and action photographers who rigorously tested all features to ensure the Grid withstands the test of time. The outer compression straps, perfect for securing things externally like tripods. The gradation pattern shoulder straps ensure a perfect fit, while the air mesh ventilation back panel provides extra lower back support during a lot of walking. I also love the perfect partners to the Grid bag, and that's the tech case for all the little doodads, but especially memory cards and batteries, and even more pertinent to me, the camera cube, which I had on me during a trip watching my son's mountain bike race, a funeral, a photo trip for this review, and I've loved being able to pack that camera cube right in the bag for the trip and have my camera protected, and then able to pull that out and use that bag with a strap as a small camera bag. Right now, Ekster has partnered with me to give you guys an exclusive discount. You can enjoy 20% off anything in this collection, as well as their battery charger, using my code GOODCAMERA, or just go to shop.ekster.com/goodcamera. All right, so back to this lens. Now, I mentioned that I was super excited about all the features of this lens. that it offers a documentary photographer like me, but being familiar with TT Artisan, which is a great brand, but is definitely a budget photographer's brand, my expectations were definitely tempered. So the first thing that I was interested in, therefore, was image quality, and here I was actually super pleasantly surprised. This lens is actually plenty sharp for my needs. I found it surprisingly sharp photographing architecture pretty much all throughout the aperture range in the center, and absolutely within my comfort zone, even at the edges and corners. I didn't scientifically test close focus for sharpness, as that's been well tested by other reviewers, but anecdotally it seemed to support those conclusions that at 5.6 and beyond, at close focus, it starts to suffer. That can make macro photography tricky, especially at the 2x, if you want a wider depth of field. So that means stacking, image stacking, or making use of the tilt shift to get the subject as parallel as possible to the sensor plane. But if you enjoy shooting macro at f4 or lower, there's absolutely nothing to complain about. You'll probably be happy with this lens. For macro hobbyists like me, where I'm not professionally seeking macro work, but it's more of a diversion from what I actually do professionally, the lack of sharpness at 5.6 and higher at close focus isn't going to bother me whatsoever. But if I were a professional macro photographer, that might be a deal breaker for me. But otherwise, as I said, this lens does the job as far as sharpness, and I was really excited to see that. As far as fringing and chromatic aberration, this lens also performs well. Thought it was controlled well. I didn't really see any issues here. It also doesn't seem to suffer unduly from distortion in general, except wide open. And I love that the lens has a 12-bladed rounded aperture for smooth out of focus elements. Having said that, there are two strikes against it for me when it comes to image quality. One, it does seem to suffer from heavy vignetting at extreme apertures, and two, it doesn't control flaring or ghosting as well as it could, but I've seen worse. And with that, unfortunately, there is no lens hood to control that, which brings us into the construction and build quality. And even when it comes to this, I'm conflicted. On the one hand, this all metal construction gives a lot of peace of mind. I typically like the feeling and reassurance of heft and a decent metal construction, and there certainly is some heft and metal here. The aperture and focusing ring are smooth, they feel quite nice. The focusing ring could have a longer range for more precision, but it's okay. And the aperture, like I said, clicks are nice. In spite of the focus range being crazy, starting at 2.1 close focus and going to infinity, the lens accomplishes the moving of elements all internally, which is great. It doesn't do that externally, which some lenses might do. So that's all great, but then we get into some of the weirder things. Like I said, this lens has a lot crammed into one package, and that does include tilting and shifting. Horizontally and vertically. To do that, TT Artisan has created some weird usability patterns that aren't easy to use and aren't intuitive per se. The first issue I had was when just putting the lens on the camera. There are, when you're putting the lens on, you're looking for those red dots, and in this case you have 3 separate red dots to confuse you with. You'll encounter 3 of them, and it's not so bad once you realize that the one on the flange is the one you want, but I think there would have been better ways to distinguish what these markers are for. Once installed, one of these red dots, this one here, allows for the rotation of the lens around the flange. This is important for allowing the tilt and shift to reorient vertically or horizontal along the axis, however you need it to. But you can also rotate the lens at various points between vertical and horizontal, so partially between the two, and that allows you to experiment with the tilt plane in different ways, so you can get some experimental photography going. I personally wouldn't have use for that, but some people might. So the lens rotation itself, that's fine, but because of the many movements allowed in the lens, including the tilt and shift mechanisms, the lens allows for a great deal of movement, or what I would call slop, in the tolerances. There's a lot of There's a lot of slop going on. In addition, that means that there's going to be a lot of places for dust and water to enter the lens, making me hesitant to want to use this in inclement weather or dusty desert conditions, which I find myself in quite a bit here in American Southwest. It just doesn't garner a feeling of reassurance about the quality of the lens. Additionally, both the tilt and the shift side of things, there is a locking and tension mechanism. And then you have your tactical, I guess, or precision knob on the other side, directly opposite. So the locking or tension side is either meant to lock the lens in place, or it's meant to just provide tension so that you can use that the tilt or shift lens ideally for smooth movement. But in practice, these tension and locking knobs are so small that it's difficult to truly lock the tilt and shift in place, meaning that the tilt or shift could suddenly just drop, right? And you're just using it and it would just kind of clunks. And I had that happen quite a bit, where it would just kind of clunk down with gravity because it's a heavy lens. And when you just want a little bit of tension or partial tension on these knobs so you can smoothly turn that tilt or shift knob, it's actually very difficult to find that sweet spot, if not impossible. They just seem to either be completely locked or completely unlocked. There's not really an in-between. And I notice it's worse with the shift side than the tilt side, because the shift side uses this little locking mechanism that's really hard to get leverage on. And the shift side uses a round knob, which is a little bit easier to use. And I don't know why the difference, honestly. It seems a little arbitrary to me. So that meant that I'd actually tend to use this lens handheld and just use my hand manually to adjust the shift to where it looked correctly. But that is super kludgy, since then you have to first manually focus the lens, of course, and then you have to drop the shift down while you manually focus and then put it back up to photograph, hoping all the while that your focus doesn't get messed up in the process. It's just fiddly. It's not ideal. I had less use for the shift functionality. I just played with it a little bit, and I did notice that the locking, tensioning knob worked better, as I said. In both cases, though, there could be a lot done to make the tilt and shift mechanisms more smooth, reliable, and precise, and I hope TT Artisan will take this feedback as an opportunity to improve this lens in future iterations. When it comes to macro photography, it's super cool that you can focus to 2.1, but in practice, it's really difficult, especially with a 100mm lens. Difficult to find the subject and sharp photo, especially if you're trying to do bugs or anything moving. A tripod becomes necessary, and I would just forget about trying to use this as a tilt shift in those situations. It would be an exercise in frustration. The other reason it's a problem is that this lens is actually quite heavy, but there's no lens stability offered. With other telephoto lenses, you often get a lens mount, tripod mount, allowing you to mount this camera and the lens on the lens itself on a tripod, balancing its center of gravity. And you can't do that with this lens, which means a lot of undue pressure on the mounting points for the camera and the flange for the lens, and just a lot of extra movement, making it harder to nail focus on the subject. You notice everything just sort of wiggles more, especially with those loose tolerances. Moreover, while this lens does come with an optional cold shoe mount, I don't know where it is, but you can mount a cold shoe here, which allows you, and that, for macro that's extremely helpful because it will allow you to mount an LED light or a flash or something to the front to get a burst of light on your subject, allowing you to use not so shallow depth of field. You don't have to crank the ISO. So that only increases the weight distribution to the precarious end of things. So when it comes to macro photography, between the weight distribution, the slop of the lens, tolerances, and what I said earlier about the quality of sharpness at close focus decreasing from apertures 5.6 and above, I cannot recommend this lens for anyone who wants to do serious macro work, unless you have the patience to work around these inconveniences. No focus tilt shift lenses out there. You still have to deal with a bit of usability kludginess, but for me personally, once I got used to using the tilt functionality manually in handheld, it worked great. But keep in mind, I shoot in daylight hours mostly with lots of light, so that means I don't have to use a tripod. If I had to use this on a tripod a lot, it might be a lot more frustrating. And I would never use this lens for a long exposure if there was any wind at all or movement, because there's just too much movement allowed on this lens. So it's not perfect, but for me and the type of work I do, it certainly earned a spot in my lens kit, in my bag, and I certainly think it's worth the money, absolutely.
That's all I've got for you for now. I hope you enjoyed these photos and the review of the lens. Remember that if you would like to get early access to my videos, as well as add an interruption-free viewing of the videos, please join me on Patreon.
Remember to do good with your cameras, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
I'm a master and you're going to lose this game.